Hello and welcome to MZ Webinars. We're really excited to be joined today by MZ's Executive VP of Global Operations, Andy Devon, and the VP of Innovation, Duncan Brown. If you have any questions during the course of this webinar, please put them in the question box in your control panel. Go to webinar control panel and we will endeavour to get to those at the end of the presentation. We'll be sharing the recording and the slides afterwards as part of a follow-up email, so please keep your eyes open for that. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Andy. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you very much. And firstly, apologies to our viewers today. Debbie had the bright idea that you guys should actually see Duncan and I. And now you're probably realizing, having seen us, why we tend to hide away a little. But we will humor Debbie today. And assuming that the numbers don't suddenly drop off, we'll carry on in this way. So hello, good to meet you, and thanks for joining us today. So I'll be pulling Duncan in shortly to the discussion, but just wanted to welcome you. Thank you for joining our session as we move into a new phase for our webinars and other activities here at MZ Burning Glass, and we start to really lean into the emerging leveling up agenda. And so today's session is really a venture into that, and there'll be more coming in due course there. So thank you and welcome for those that are regular viewers, listeners, watchers, and welcome to anyone who's joined us for the first time. As always, a quick intro to who we are as MZ Burning Glass, and as you can see on the slide on the screen there, a summary of our vision and our mission. Our goal globally is to be an authority on the labour market, and particularly with a focus on leading the transition to a future of work that's based around skills and competencies. So really about getting into the skin and understanding of what's driving the labour market. And our view is that if we can be helpful in pulling together insights and data on that and work with great organizations in education, economic development and business such as yourselves, we can then help you make better decisions about the labor market and help your stakeholders and communities in turn be more informed about what's happening in the labor market so they can make more informed choices. And our view is that if we can help you and you can help your audiences and your customers, then we can help build collectively a more efficient and effective labor market that really does help all of us prosper around the world. So it's a big mission. We can't do it ourselves, but we believe if we can bring good data to the work that you guys do, then we can be very helpful to that. So we tend to kick off by bringing in Duncan, our senior economist, and giving us a quick update on what's happening in the UK labour market. So Duncan, would you like to say hi and jump in on that before we get into the main topic today?
Hello, I'm Duncan. I bought my face for radio. So we're going to start off with my sort of go-to charts. One of them really understandable and the other one quite hard to explain. So I'll start with the easy to understand one on the left, where we have the unemployment rate in black, the vacancy rate in purple, and the redundancy rate in green. And it's the latest data which got to December. Are a continuation of the pattern that we'd seen all the way through the last months of 2021, which is the sort of the vacancy rate continuing to climb, and having never had vacancies of the order of 1.2 million on the ONS vacancy survey, we've had it at that level for 3 months solid now through October, November, December. So really record levels of vacancies. Unemployment is kind of really back down to the levels that we saw in sort of 2018 kind of territory. So it's historically low. They were low levels then. I mean, sort of levels rarely seen in the preceding decades. Redundancies are really low, sort of having been back to normal. They've dipped a bit further. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the Beveridge curve, which combines the unemployment and the vacancy rate over time. And the purple line is the interesting bit here because that's our experience from COVID. And starting at that point around 2.5% vacancy rate and around 3 or 4% unemployment rate, we saw the plummet down to a vacancy rate of 1%. And then after the first few months, unemployment started to push it out, and we hit unemployment going above 5%, and it since came down. And now those high vacancies are dragging the unemployment rate back. And we're in this territory continuously where we've not been on the data before, where we have vacancies way above the norm for this level of unemployment. What unemployment there is now, bearing in mind that we're kind of got to be close to what we economists call the natural rate of unemployment, which is the level that you expect to have as people just move between jobs, and some people arriving into the labour market and some people choosing to leave and so on. It's going to be difficult to see how much lower it can go, and that's probably why the line is kind of moving left much more and more slowly on the Beveridge curve there. And so, and at some point, we anticipate the vacancy rate will probably come back down, because there's no point hiring if you can't find people. But to some extent at the moment, this reflects an ongoing churn of people in work, and maybe that's a catch-up from people having not moved as much during the sort of the core period of the pandemic. But we'll have to see on that one.
Fascinating, thank you.
And then so what we also do, because we're Emirates Brown and Glass, and this is what we do, we monitor online job ads. And so what I've done here is put together a chart which has the weekly total of active job ads across 4 years. So green is in 2019, so that's the year before the pandemic. Black is the year of the pandemic, rather fittingly, in terms of its sorts of difficulties, and you can see that big drop there from about week 13, and then the recovery thereafter. Purple is the really impressive recovery line of 2021, and what's interesting there is that the final weeks of 2021 actually saw quite a big falling off of online job ads. And so really there was this peak at the end of November, or toward the end of November, and then after that it started to fall away. And the last sort of 4 weeks, even more than normal years, you can see that in sort of 2020 and 2019, December is not exactly a buoyant period, but there was a real falling off. And it just feels like, after having had the foot on the accelerator for most of the year, it's almost like employers decided to give it a breather in December. But what's interesting is that if you look at the left-hand side, we've only got the first 8 weeks or so of 2022, this blue line, but you can see that it is actually coming back up and is way ahead of where it was in previous years. Having started the year around the level it was in 2019, sort of the boost that we've seen since then means it's now way above that level as we ended February.
Wow, and it's really interesting, as you said earlier, Duncan, the how long this can keep going, given that the tightening of the labour market, there is clearly a lack of people to go around to meet the needs of the vacancies, and how long will we just keep hammering postings out there and seeking hiring, versus how when the economy maybe adapts slightly to the situation. So it's one close eye on for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And this next chart helps us to just think a little bit about what's going on under the surface there. So what I did here was I looked at the number of postings in each of these salary categories for February in 2019, 2020, 2021 and 2022. Now, this kind of sees somewhat past the COVID effect, because obviously February in 2020 there wasn't really a sort of we were hearing about COVID, but it wasn't kind of having the big effect. But that's all right, really, because in a way I want to try and get it to grips with the sort of the underlying trend of what's going on. And one thing to caveat this is that not all job ads have salaries advertised on them, and in fact, if anything, it's probably more likely that you'll get job ads with salaries on them in a tighter labour market than in a looser one, because employers want to advertise how much they're paying to try and attract people. So you need that as kind of background, really. But what's interesting here is that you can see, first of all, that in every category there's an increase in 2022 February compared to all the preceding 3 years, except the below 20,000 one, below 1999, as it's got it there. But it's effectively 20,000, so we'll call it that. So that one's slightly below where it was in 2019. But that is these days quite a low paying category. There's not that many jobs that sort of are kind of career type jobs in that one. So I think we can bracket that one off. What's really interesting is that it's of the other categories here, it's the 30,000s, which is kind of, quite a way in the middle sort of band. For people who are in full-time jobs, post-education, that's kind of a really important category, and that's the one that's actually showing the weakest bounce back. There is a bounce back from all the preceding years before, including 2019. But if you compare it to the 20,000s, where we're way above where we were in the preceding 3 years, and in all of the categories above, the performance is better. And in fact, in most of those categories above, we see actually a progression, even with the pandemic in 2021. Every year is higher than the previous year, and then 2022 is significantly higher. And even in that 90,000 and over category, where there's more of a lull in early 2020 and a return to normal in 2021, and 2022 is way higher. And so it's quite interesting that we have this kind of hourglass effect where we see sort of low paid jobs really bouncing back well, sort of in the 20,000s range, or lower paid jobs, and yet these higher paid categories are also really growing handsomely, and it's the jobs in the 30,000s, which are kind of more middle skill sort of level jobs a lot of the time, that you really see the sort of a more subdued effect. Still growing, and so it's good news there as elsewhere. But yeah, there is a pronounced sort of difference between the sort of the 20,000s and then the 40,000 and above category compared to the 30,000s.
Yeah, interesting, fascinating. I suppose you mentioned the caveat that not all job postings necessarily have a salary mentioned, and we also need to think of some of the inherent biases in online job postings, perhaps more relevant for the professional end of the labour market relative to the lower skilled end of the labour market as well, that might have some influence on that. But we're looking at relativity here, aren't we, really, when you're comparing it? So even so, it's a stark trend.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's also worth saying that sort of the raw numbers of the two kind of groups in the middle there, the 20,000s and the 30,000, are also much larger than a lot of the higher pay ones. So when we talk about growth in the 90,000 and over category, we've gone from, say, 20,000 postings in 2020 to around 35,000 postings this year, whereas in the £20,000 salary sort of band, we've gone from £250,000 to 450,000. So the sheer volume is quite significantly different, but the relativity, as you say, is still really fascinating.
Great, thanks, Duncan. Thanks for the quick intro of what we're seeing out there, and hopefully helpful. And some of this really does actually help set, particularly this last one, context for today's topic and the topic that we'll be pursuing over the next few months as well, which is really thinking about the levelling up agenda. We can't escape it in the media and in conversation and in policy circles. So today, our goal really for today's webinar is to start to unpick what we mean by levelling up, reflecting on pertinent points that are coming out, particularly in official publications, and then Duncan's going to return and share a few interesting and highly relevant trends that we're seeing in the labour market relative to what's being discussed in these publications, and just start to peer into the topic a bit more and set the foundations for future activities that we've got going on. And then, as always, keen to point you towards various resources that we can support your work and thinking on this topic around as well. So that's the goal for today. And I'm going to just take a quick walk through really the basics of what do we mean by levelling up. It's a term that we've heard for many years now, and the definitions are starting to become clearer as the government policy becomes a bit clearer on this topic. So what do we mean by levelling up? And I've cribbed this from the government's levelling up website. So this is not my own work for sure, but there are four key overarching themes that the government have identified as kind of what we mean by leveling up. First one here is really thinking about productivity, pay and jobs, living standards, and basically the goal is to raise these right across the country, but to particularly focus on those areas, those parts of the country that are lagging behind, to see if we can close the gap between the highest performing and the lowest performing regions across our country. And a lot of that will be through spreading opportunity into particularly those areas of relative weakness. So we've often heard so much about the London bubble and the fact that so much power and decision making is centered there. Of course, devolution and other activities have been spreading that, and the leveling up agenda is really about continuing to press on those themes, particularly focusing on public services and improving performance in some of the weaker performing areas. There's also, as well as a sort of an economic component to it, there is definitely a strong social component and undertones to the leveling up agenda, and particularly around community and pride and belonging in areas. I think it's often been quite clearly seen a connection between the economic performance and social performance there, and so making sure that, as well as driving economic agendas, that we can also unpick and strengthen communities. Those two definitely go hand in hand. And I suppose the mechanism for a lot of this is about empowerment into localities and communities to make decisions that are right for the area, as opposed to what are deemed centrally as the things to do. So really empowering local leaders and communities to take a lead on these topics. So as I say, I cribbed that from the Leveling Up website, and there's some good resources there. So certainly encourage, if you're interested in learning more, to go and visit that site if you haven't already found it in your explorations and research. So with those four kind of key drivers and I suppose outcomes in mind, we've started to see a bit more detail emerging. And beginning of last month, the much awaited Leveling Up white paper was published, and picked out and started to put some flesh on the bones, and picked out 12 key policy missions to think about that, in terms of driving those four key agendas. I've picked out, given the work that we do here at MZ Burning Glass and the work we do with you guys and your communities, I've picked out a couple of the most pertinent of the 12 key policy missions to us and to me. One of those missions is really built around jobs, and thinking about that whole pay, employment, productivity driver that we talked about, I mentioned just a moment ago, and again continuing to close the gap between the top performing areas and the lower performing areas, not by leveling down, but by improving those areas who have most to gain, and grow there. So very targeted activities there. And then the other dimension is loosely in the kind of skills and training arena, with a real aspiration to increase the uptake and of high quality, high skilled training across England and UK, and the idea being that if we can upskill the workforce, we can take advantage of higher skilled job roles, more productive job roles, and attract growth and economic growth accordingly. So some interesting themes there. I also wanted to reflect, as I read through the summary, just the importance of place. And this is something, if you're long-time viewers of not just these corporate webinars, but pretty much anything that we do and put out across MZ Burning Glass and have done for the last 10 years, we've really majored on the importance of place and locality. And definitely the Leveling Up agenda is really founded on this. And the devolution component that I mentioned a moment ago, which is another one of the 12 policy missions, really does major on creating a mechanism of place-based decision making So many of you will be familiar with the mayoral combined authorities and the role that LEPs have played over the last few years. And of course, the levelling up agenda really is about driving forward more of that. So putting more power over budgets and decision making and spending in employment and skills agenda. So things like the adult education budget, and also the skills and localized skills improvement plans that many of you will be familiar with. The interesting thing about the white paper was it called out 9 specific regions to come forward and really put their hats into the ring, in terms of driving forward this. I presume that wasn't a surprise to the 9, that they didn't just discover that when they read the report, that this has been part of ongoing discussions previously, but very interesting that these 9 regions were sort of called out, and we'll actually dig into that in a moment as we think about some of the insights that we can share with you today around this topic. So place really a critical factor, and of course data is a critical factor, because it's all well and good having these ambitions and missions and mechanisms, but as we know, and as we have eulogized for many years now, of course, decision making is severely hampered and weakened if it doesn't have good data underpinning those decisions. And that's, as I mentioned before, that's our purpose. That's why we exist, to bring insights about the labour market. And that's one of the key dimensions, of course, associated with this agenda. The goal is the government basically identifying 2 new data focused units, the spatial data unit and the unit for future skills, which is designed to try and bring more of what lies within government from a data perspective, both in terms of data about what's happening in the labour market, but wider skills, and thinking about the impact of spend as well. So we'll certainly be watching with interest as those units emerge. We actually work with a number of the agencies that are feeding into that, so hopefully we'll gain some interesting insights and hopefully have a role to play in shaping that, for sure. But as you know, we definitely get the importance of good data, and quite frankly, that's what we've been doing for the last 10 years, and we very much plan to continue to do for many years to come, in really illuminating the labour market dimension of that. So I'll leave you to read the exciting 300 or so page report for yourselves to get the true nuance. I just wanted to pick out a few things that were interesting to us, for sure, from our perspective, and things that we're already thinking about and have been, quite frankly, working on for many years pre-leveling up agenda. But as I certainly and colleagues, as we read through the materials and thought about what does this really mean, I think what struck me was there is really a core element at the heart of this matter, which is skills. It's all about having a productive workforce. It really puts talent at the heart of community, and thinking about economics as a driver for social change and alongside social change as well. And really, if we think about the way the economy works these days, it really is ever more about understanding the skills that we have as workers and in the workforce. It's about understanding the skills we need in our economy to help us now, but also to drive change, and thinking therefore about what the difference is between those two, so that we can drive interventions that will ensure that the supply of skills aligns very nicely to the demand for skills. And that, of course, is right at the heart of who we are and what we do. And so just a reminder, when I mention what our vision is, we really get this, and I feel like we've got a lot to give, and hopefully a lot to give you to support your important work in all of this. So I'd like to now bring you back in, Duncan. Welcome back. Because we thought, certainly at this early kind of introductory stage, and given what I've just described there, it might be helpful to actually showcase some interesting insights that we're seeing on this topic that we think can be helpful to our ongoing thinking collectively, and might actually be quite illuminating to maybe some of the thinking that's going on, or the traditional thinking about how we address the skills agenda on a local basis. So I'll hand back to you, and you can talk us through some interesting insights you've quickly pulled together for us.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, so really just to start us thinking about the whole kind of levelling up problem, such as it is, and its connection with skills in the labour market. And what I did was, all the red dots here are kind of the local authority groupings that are equivalent to travel to work areas, and I've plotted them in terms of two broad dimensions. So on the x-axis, we've got the share of educated working age people that have got either sort of, well, a level 4 or 5 qualification and above, basically. So a HND or something like that. Most of them have got bachelor's degrees and so on. And this is initially plotted in 2010. And then on the y-axis there, we've got the share of high-skilled jobs, which is in the traditional sort of classification of that, which is that they're in SOC major groups 1, 2, or 3, so managers, professionals, and associate professional roles. Because, you know, generally speaking, we think that the high-skilled jobs are kind of high-skilled demand, and HE-educated workers are high-skilled supply. So roughly, bearing in mind that we're talking about sort of rough travel to work areas, you would expect them to broadly align. And you can see there's a strong sort of diagonal element to it, that sort of more educated workers means more educated jobs. And this is a sort of a framework that's been used by the OECD, where we take the average, which are the two sort of black lines, the sort of the horizontal and the vertical, across all the areas, and they give us 4 quadrants. So in the top right-hand quadrant, we have the high skill equilibrium, and that big red bubble at the top there is London. And most of the others are also in that band of southeastern regions around London, which is kind of, when we talk about levelling up, they are the up bits that we want to level to. Fundamentally, they're the areas of the country that tend to have, as you can see here, more high-skilled jobs, generally more educated sorts of population on this measure. And they also, as a corollary of that, have higher productivity and higher incomes to some extent as well. Not to say that there aren't problems in there. London, for example, sort of the spread of income when you compare it to housing cost actually means that people who live in London often aren't that well off. But overall, across the Great Southeast, that's the sort of the situation that we're talking about. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, where we see a lot of regions, including all 9 of our sort of new levelling up proposed regions that the levelling up white paper talks about, and they're all down in green with text labels there. We have what's called a low skill equilibrium, where the share of workers with those high education qualifications and the share of high skilled jobs are both lower. And the logic behind this is that sort of markets kind of are finding equilibrium, and so they can either be at a high equilibrium level where there's lots of educated workers and so employers create lots of jobs to make use of their skills, or we have a low equilibrium one, and the sort of the two things feed into each other. It's not worth getting a better education because you can't get a high skilled job anyway. And then the sort of off the diagonal, we have 2 other categories. So at the top left, where very few regions live, is skills gaps, where we've got lots more high skilled jobs than high skilled workers. We don't have many places like that, which is interesting, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And then on the other hand, we have skill surplus, where we have lots more high educated workers than we have high educated jobs. And so the fact that the skills gap one isn't really there is quite interesting, because what it suggests is that generally speaking, at this aggregate level, we don't tend to have a situation where we get lots of high skilled jobs being created in the absence of these workers. But this was all in 2010. So yeah.
Thinking the skills surplus areas, they're not labelled, and I can't expect you to have remembered every single dot on your every chart that you've ever done. But what would characterise these areas? Would these be pleasant rural dominated areas that are commutable to perhaps high skill equilibrium type regions?
Generally, there'll be an element of that, and there'll be an element of just kind of well-educated areas that may or may not be getting high-skilled jobs as well. Some of them commuting, some of them not. It is entirely possible that you could end up with a situation where lots of educated people are being developed, but for other reasons, because we know that skills is a derived demand from other economic aspects. It's quite difficult to sort of see the high skilled job creation that goes with it. The advantage that London and the South East has is that London is a global kind of metropolitan centre with its share of high skill industries like finance and insurance and technology that does create those jobs. So it's and I think that's the thing. Whenever we have a skills conversation, we always need to remember that skills is a derived demand.
And actually, just referencing that point back to the earlier bullet points I was working from, the talk about regional growth is very much to have a globally recognized economic center in every single one of our regions. I mean the old government office regions when we talk about regions, but the likes of Bristol in the southwest, and such forth, really being recognized on a global scale. And presume therefore the hope is that once you've got that hook in, then surrounding regions will benefit from being close to a major center of economic activity, as we see London and the southeast very much acting.
Yeah, that is the intention. I mean, the flip side of that is that the kind of the sort of the ability of smaller urban centres to kind of make themselves stand out is harder now than it once was, because our kind of move to knowledge intensive industries sort of in the information age means that sort of what economists talk about in terms of agglomeration, which is having more things together, is actually sort of the potential for agglomeration is increased. So that's why we across the world, our bigger urban centres are so dominant now: London, New York, and Los Angeles, and so on and so forth. And it's harder for more regional cities to actually stand out. If you go back to the industrial age, Sheffield for its steel and so on, it was much easier with kind of your sort of manufacturing industries to establish yourself as a centre of expertise. But the sort of the benefits of having all the sort of information intensive, knowledge intensive industries together are much greater, and that means that sort of larger urban centres find it much easier to kind of keep on scaling and growing, basically.
Interesting. So, as you say, this was looking back at 2010. So you've looked at how things have changed since then, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got the data for 2020. I've taken all the other areas off because it gets confusing, especially as I add these green lines on to sort of see how our 9 devolved regions have changed. And the big change that we've seen during this period, and this reflects a sort of a decades-long shift, is that in this country, across the whole UK, but this is just focused on England, we've expanded higher education for very good reasons in many ways. And one of the reasons was the view that by looking at an analysis like this, that it would create the raw material to actually grow a more high-skilled economy across the country. And in sort of efficiency terms, that's certainly happened. You can see that all of these regions have seen a significant boost, sort of normally of the 5 to 10% range in the share of workers with these higher education level qualifications. That seems quite a big number, but you have to remember that you've got a double effect, because you've not only got new workers coming through who've had access to much greater education opportunity, but the workers leaving the workforce often didn't have anything like that much. So you can imagine a sort of situation where the workers leaving the workforce who were in their sort of mid-60s during the 2010s were people who probably fewer than 10% of them went to university overall, whereas the generation coming through now, it's more like 40%. And so over time, that allows for quite an accelerated change. You can see all of these regions, especially Leicestershire and Derbyshire, Leicestershire and Devon, sorry, have really seen big boosts. But you can also see the black line, the vertical black line, has also moved out as well. So in large part, relatively speaking, they've maintained their position. But what's really interesting, and this is a sort of a national side of things, is that the sort of the share of high skilled jobs hasn't actually increased that much. And that's within these regions. In fact, you can look at a region like Durham where it's declined a little. Some of the regions, Nottinghamshire and Nottingham, has sort of seen a pretty good move up towards the sort of the average level. And Leicestershire and Devon have also seen some increase in Derbyshire and Derby and so on. But overall, the sort of the move to the right is a lot stronger than the move upwards. And so to some extent, what we found is that churning out more higher educated workers has had a limited effect in terms of generating high skilled demand, basically. And you know, that raises all kinds of questions about the efficacy of education. You know that we have good evidence that sometimes creating higher educated workers can be really beneficial for an economy, but I think it feels a bit like we've kind of done really well quantitatively, but maybe qualitatively there's something missing there, and sort of that raises all kinds of questions about sort of, you know, how you can move these places, because as we can see, they're all, you know, for a huge increase in their higher educated workforce, they're all still squarely in the sort of the revised version of the low skill equilibrium quadrant. And so that's really quite interesting to me, that it shows how hard it is to break out of that pattern.
Fascinating. Thanks for the data. When you quickly summarize that up before we maybe dive slightly beneath the headlines?
Yeah, exactly. So nationally, as it says there, we've added a lot more to supply than demand on high skills, and you know, both have grown. It's interesting, you know, high skilled jobs, there has been some good growth. It's just that the job market generally has grown, whereas higher educated supply, we've really done well at growing, but it hasn't really had that effect. And you know, Leicestershire and Devon have got close to moving out of the low skill equilibrium quadrant. They're in the borderline area to moving to sort of skill surplus, but that suggests that they've done much better at raising supply than raising demand. And they're kind of, yeah, there is a question, maybe there's a tipping point there, that at some point there'll be so many workers there that sort of make it attractive. Although there's one other dimension that this analysis doesn't cover, which is can you do jobs remotely more and therefore live in an area to sort of but not have the economy in the area. But that's a whole other question for now. And so, but you know, there is this big question, given that move that we've seen on higher education supply not being matched by demand, is that, you know, does it just end up generating lots more higher educated workforce, but not actually giving the jobs that they sort of are looking for? And so you end up with a lot more underemployment amongst the sort of the graduate workforce. Does that in turn then lead them to start moving away, and maybe they look for job opportunities, especially if they're quite talented? And of course that can reinforce the leveling up problem, because maybe they start thinking, well, if I move down south, then I can get a better job. And so, you know, and sort of the loop goes on, and we never actually break out of the pattern of geographic inequality. And then on the other hand, maybe if you get enough, maybe there's a critical mass of abundant higher educated workforce that will attract employers to the area. But as I was talking about a bit ago, skills is a derived demand. You have to have a reason for employers to be in your area. And you know, Devon's a lovely place. I've been to Devon, you've been to Devon. It's a great place, but it is an outlying place within the UK's economic geography. The UK's economic geography is sort of centred around the southeast and has a sort of a densely populated area sort of spreading out into the middle of the country, which tends to be less well off, but still is quite busy. And then the sort of the areas to the southwest, and then sort of to the further north and west, tends to struggle to kind of compete because of those those agglomeration dimensions around London that we were talking about a bit ago. And so it's kind of, you know, it's all very well saying we've got lots of skilled workers, but why do employers want to be in your area is also an important part of the question as well. So that raises all kinds of questions about demonstrating to them that there's sufficient other benefits of being in the area besides the sort of skilled workforce.
Yeah, no, really fascinating. And when you shared the analysis, it really struck me, especially relative to maybe some conversations you and I have been in together in the past in local areas, where often, and I think is a historic viewpoint, but still a standard one, which was, well, the best way for us to grow our economy is to get a university. Let's put a university in our town, and then employers will flood in because we'll have skilled labor, and that will be the catalyst to drive our economy. Or we need a higher education center, or we need this, that, and the other. Really thinking on the supply of labor rather than thinking about necessarily how do we stimulate demand, and drive the growth from the demand side. So yeah, fascinating how the data over that period of time has not necessarily shown that just because we have a proportion of our workforce educated to a higher level, the jobs will come. They clearly have in some places, but have disappeared in other places.
Yeah, exactly right.
So not as clear a link as we might think. So clearly we need to do things differently going forward, right? And it might well be upskilling and clearly upskilling is going to be a critical factor, but is it just generically putting a university in, or just getting more higher skilled, or is it maybe a bit more nuanced than that, do we think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we were talking about this in the run up to this webinar, it was kind of this whole question about, does the sort of the mix of skills always matter? Or more than the actual headlines, because this conversation so far has been much more about the sort of the kind of the net position of high skilled workers and high skilled jobs. But what about the sort of the differences between them? That you can have an area where there's there's an apparently sort of an equilibrium at a low skill level, but you might have high skilled employers that are there, like really thirsting after workers, but they can't get them. And if you could actually deliver the right kind of workers to them in terms of skills, then it could actually make quite a big difference.
Absolutely. So taking your examples of Devon and Leicestershire that you picked out here as exemplars, we've looked into that, right? We've dug beneath the headlines. So talk us through that, and let's start with Devon, and what is driving high skill demand in Devon then?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started off by looking at the sort of those high skilled three major groups of occupations, and what you can see is kind of there's good job creation amongst high skilled roles there. You've got nurses at the top, big workforce category, obviously, and one of the things that we talked about a bit when we were sort of looking at this is that actually Devon's list has got a lot of the kinds of high skilled jobs that you'll find everywhere. So there are nurses in every part of the country, because of course you need nurses to look after people wherever people live. The same with teachers, the same with housing and estate managers and doctors. And it's only when you get to sort of salespeople, although they're fairly well spread too, but it's more the sort of the manufacturing managers that you start to get a job that is actually more distinctive, because you have to have a significant manufacturing industry in your region in order to be able to sort of require those kinds of jobs. And so there's a good mix here, and there are job openings. You can see there on the right hand column that Devon needs an estimated 600 production managers over the next 5 years, so or the current 5 years period. So there's certainly skills demands there, but we can also look at what kinds of skills that go with that. And you can see there that there's a pretty good mix. I mean, the soft skills are pretty similar wherever you go, because they're communications and management and those kinds of things. So that's pretty normal. And you can see there that on the harder skills side, there are specific asks that employers have, which reflect those jobs. So nursing is up there because, unsurprisingly, nursing jobs require nursing. But we can also see some good financial skills required, and we can also see creeping in there agile methodology. So although none of the top 10 are software roles, obviously there's sort of enough of the demand out there for agile methodology to sort of get a look in.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's Devon. I suppose if we really want to think about how do we at least make sure that the high skilled workforce is aligned to what the economy needs, then this is the sort of insight that can help us at least address that. And I suppose the hope is that by meeting that demand might then have spin-off benefits, particularly if you think about what you mentioned around manufacturing.
Yeah, absolutely.
A thriving manufacturing sector, and of course there's there's detail to go further in terms of what kind of manufacturing, what kind of roles that sit within that, and that will be a range of skill levels, not just the high skilled that we're focusing on.
Absolutely, yeah, because you have production managers because you've got production workers to manage at the end of the day. So that kind of gives a hint to that. But yeah, I think the thing is that what we're trying to do here, and this is just at an exploratory level across the top 10 roles and then the sort of the top 10 skills that go with them, is demonstrate that just as we were looking at that expanding the higher educated workforce is only actually, in broad terms, only gets you so far. Actually, you've got to be much more targeted about making sure that you're delivering the kinds of skills that will actually meet the needs within the area.
And this is where place really kicks in, right? So we're looking at Devon here. We've now pulled Leicestershire, done exactly the same analysis for Leicestershire. What are we seeing here?
Yeah, I mean, so Leicestershire is really interesting because actually there are a couple more jobs that add some kind of colour to the local economy. So they also have needs for production managers in manufacturing, but they also have managers in storage and warehousing. So if you know Leicestershire well, as I do, because I live here, there's a huge cluster of the warehousing industry down around Magna Park. Because Leicestershire is in the middle of the country and is really well connected, it's a natural location for that kind of business, and also creates lots of lower skilled and middle skilled jobs that goes with that. But at the high skill end, this is kind of an important centre for the logistics industry, which has been fast growing, and so therefore that's part of it. But also there, really high skilled job, you've got programmers and software development professionals coming in at the top 10. So actually, that the sort of the digital sector comes in. And on the right hand side, we've highlighted there there's some slight differences in the skill mix that Leicestershire has compared to Devon, where warehousing creeps into high skilled jobs, skills demand. So does supply chain as well. So that kind of logistics sector effect is really prominent, but also new product development and purchasing is also in there, and problem solving and operations. So you can sort of see a different skills mix, and it just shows, as you say, that place, because place drives the sort of the mix of industries. And in the past we've talked about the sort of the contrast between local industries, which are things like healthcare and retail and things like that are just wherever people live, those industries need to be, and the tradable industries, which really characterize a local economy because they're the things that are bringing money into the area. They're the industries that define the area's economy and therefore give it some shape and some drive that if you can harness that, then you can actually see some sort of lasting growth and break out of the sort of, if you're in a low skill equilibrium pattern, and if you can find a way to kind of generate those kind of changes in those industries, then it does allow you the sort of the potential to start changing things. And and so those are the kinds of conversations, and this is the kind of data that you kind of need to be sort of thinking about in order to get to that kind of destination.
Yeah, it strikes me just thinking this through that as you describe that national strategies, national activities should more than nicely cover off those local industry trends that which is in the majority of what we've seen in both Devon and Leicestershire here, and as you described, healthcare, education, those retail, those standard elements that we find everywhere. And perhaps thinking about the powers that come through devolution, particularly for these areas, the real focus should be on what makes those areas stand out and are different, and embrace those trade clusters. So you mentioned Leicestershire really being strong on the distribution side of things, given its geographic location. You'll have parts of the country where transport, water transport and distribution around ports will be a unique factor to build on. Similarly, creative industries in creative hubs, financial hub, all those sorts of things. So would the recommendation be that where more powers come, let national strategies cover off the foundational economy, really dig in on what makes you different, particularly in that tradable economy, that will have an impact not just locally but will place these areas globally in a globally connected world?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, there's lots that central government is, and probably even more that it should be doing about, say, the healthcare workforce. And actually, part of the problem with healthcare workforce is an extremely distinctive set of skills that often take a long time to generate, and will tend to sort of spread across the country. I mean, you get centres like there are bits of London, and you go to Cambridge, you go to Addenbrooke's Hospital, and so on, where it does become economically significant. But in most of the country, hospitals are big employers, say, but there are hospitals everywhere, really. It's kind of because they have to be where people live, and so to some extent you can rely on sort of those kind of industries to sort of look after themselves. To varying extents they'll be successful, but in terms of changing your economy, if, say, Devon invested heavily in developing its healthcare workforce, past a certain point some of those workers will start to move away, because actually the sort of the constraint on Devon's healthcare sector is its kind of local demand. And unless it could make a huge leap in certain kinds of capabilities that meant people went there, then it becomes quite difficult to sort of see. The same with Leicestershire as well. Whereas if you can make your local industries, your local manufacturing industries, or develop other kinds of clusters of industries that are bringing sort of effectively export income into their area, then actually that starts to kick off that kind of virtuous circle where actually there are business opportunities that attract investment, and they start to want more workers, and so on and so forth. And so that's kind of, if you're going to actually see a sort of an equilibrium change to a sort of a higher level performance, that's the kind of move that you need to make.
Yeah, I'm a massive believer in playing to strengths. And of course, we know the economy is changing, and there are many globally outside factors that are changing what historically would be a strength. But if you can play to your strengths and then align those strengths to emerging technologies, then you're in a win-win position. And we've worked hard on that. And we have a set of reports in our tools called pulled together called Strength Finder, which is really about helping identify those local and regional strengths and relative strengths as well. So that's definitely something I think that this agenda can spearhead for sure. Thank you, Duncan, for sharing some of your wisdom, only a little bit of it. There's plenty more to come, and sharing some of those insights. Hopefully, it's been helpful to folks, and is getting you thinking a little bit about how that this kind of types of analysis will help shape your thinking and priorities around this. And just to reinforce, this is all about us. This is why we do what we do, is to help you make those decisions, recognize those strengths, play to those strengths, diversify your economy, ensure we've got the right skills coming through. This is why we produce the data that we do. Whilst of course we're all data geeks at this side and love the data for its own sake, actually what we're motivated by is that data being used to really drive change. And this leveling up agenda feels like a real opportune moment for everyone, particularly given what's going on in the world and where we've come from in the last few years as well. So we want to be alongside you. We want to help you. We've got a lot of the insights and the data we think you need for this. So we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear about your strategies and your plans, and let challenge us to see how we can help you, how we can help you support that. And as I say, I think if we can get to the bottom of really just what's driving opportunity in your region, both thinking about the sorts of industries and roles, but ever more so really starting to understand the specific skills that are driving this forward, then then I think you can make fantastic decisions and really put your regions on the map and push this forward. And of course, whilst leveling up is about closing the gaps, it's about growth everywhere. That's the core as well. So this isn't just something that the 9 areas should care about and the rest can sit down and wait. No, this is for everyone and everywhere for sure. So we have a whole range of data, tools, products, services, Duncan and his team with fantastic wisdom to bring around that data as well to help you out. So please do feel free to reach out. And we've got some really exciting new solutions coming through as well that we'll be announcing in the coming weeks. That is really about trying to democratize more of that data and get more of that data into the hands of your communities and key stakeholders that you're working with. So whilst we sit on a wealth of data and have great research tools and capabilities, and we want to empower you to utilize those, we're looking at ways in which we can help you get more of that information out to more people in your communities and stakeholders. So we've got some fantastic new solutions coming, which we're really excited about, and we'll keep you posted. Also, if you're interested in just diving into your own area, I just want to remind you of what we were looking at in our previous series, which is the UK Regional Labour Market Outlook report that we produced at the beginning of the year. That's still available to find at the web address that I've put on the slide there. And if you haven't done so already, you can request your local area reports, so you can start to get a feel for what's driving your local area if you're interested. So do check that out. And as mentioned, this agenda is going to be dominating our thinking as a group for the months to come, for sure, as we look to try and help you understand the role that data and tools like ours can help around this topic. So we have a series of webinars and other events coming up. The next one is later this month, and each of our sector leaders will be gathering and talking about what the levelling up agenda means to their customers. So further education, higher education, communities and government will be discussing that and thinking about what it means independently for the work that they're seeing their customers doing, but also thinking about how we can bring this together around the power, using the power of place. And there's some exciting examples to bring through there. So there's a date for your diary. But Duncan and I will, and others over the coming months, will be continuing to dive into aspects of the agenda. April's session will dive more deeply into skills and the skills dimension of the levelling up agenda, and then we'll move on in May to look at it from a local area partnership and working together, and the role that data can play in terms of helping communities pull together. And then in June, we'll be looking at where those disparities lie greatest, and we've hinted at a couple of examples, and thinking about how do we really combat those and challenge those and drive those forward to narrow the gap that we see across our country. So you can sign up for all of those at the usual economicmodelling.co.uk/webinars page. And last piece of information from me, just a quick customer update to keep existing customers aware of what's going on through the merger, that we can continue to knit pieces of MZ and Burning Glass together. So we have now created a single source and pipeline of job postings data that was delivered with love on Valentine's Day, February 14th, to our analyst customers. So users of Analyst and Labour Insight are now utilizing the same source job postings data there. So that's a big move forward and a massive improvement. And we've provided summaries of what that means, but fantastic news for our customers there, and stronger data sets there. We also now have just updated our underlying structural labour market data. So that's the data we glean from official statistics that describe the stock of labour, and we're each time we bring that new data set through, we rebuild our trend-based projections to evolve and learn from what's actually been happening in recent times in the labour market. And this now gives us really an early structural view of the COVID economic impacts on the workforce. So some fantastic insights. It has obviously changed some of those projections accordingly, to reflect the realities of what's happened over the last couple of years. Keep an eye on the blog site, where we've provided articles that dive into more detail and information on those. So I think other than just to flag an additional webinar from our further education team, so Ben will be joined by Karen Turley from South Staffordshire College, talking about the role of data, skills data and labour market information for curriculum planning alignment. Of course, a critical factor of ensuring that the education system is really pulling in the same direction on the levelling up agenda as well. So check that out. That's on Wednesday, 23rd of March. That's an important date for me because it's my son's birthday, but it also would be the 2nd anniversary of the first lockdown, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a memorable date for me for sure. So I think that's everything, all the notices. I'm mindful that we have completely run out of time, so apologies that we won't get to any questions, but we will review those and come back to folks afterwards. But thank you for joining me. Thank you, Duncan, as ever, for being there to add wisdom to our webinar and help share the insights that we are sharing with you. And thank you, Debbie, for hosting us once again.
More than welcome. Thanks ever so much, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.